Hello and welcome back to Ask the Expert. Today we're joined by Harris Schneiderman, Principal UI Engineer at Deque. Welcome, Harris.
Hello.
So to kick us off, Harris, can you tell us more about what you do as a Principal UI Engineer and how that relates to accessibility?
Yeah, I focus mostly on the front end, but I definitely do some back end work as well. I primarily work on the product Axe Beta. I've been with it since the start, and I've been kind of involved in the creation of intelligent guided tests, which I will probably further explain here in a minute.
Awesome. Yeah, we definitely want to get into intelligent guided testing. So taking a step back for a moment, how did you get started in the accessibility field?
I actually got a start on the accessibility field here at DQ. I was hired here straight out of college, and I had approximately zero accessibility experience aside from, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes where we talked about alt text in one of my front end classes in college. So I came in here with kind of a blank slate, not knowing what to expect. And it turned out that I was extremely interested in accessibility as a whole. And so I immediately kind of dove as deep as I could get into WCAG and ARIA, reading everything, consuming as much as I could, and learning with firsthand experience. Some of the projects I started off on would be to take existing broken content and writing some JavaScript to turn it into something more accessible. So it was kind of cool to see that side of things where we have some, unfortunately, production code that's completely unusable by someone, users like screen reader users, and having to get really creative where it's like, well, the ship has sailed on this widget, but what can we do now to make it better for users with disabilities? So I came in with nothing, was really passionate about it, and took interest in it. So that's what's kind of fueling me to this day.
Fantastic. And I think that segues well into my next question, which is about what are some of the most common mistakes developers make when they're first starting out in the world of accessibility? And what would be your advice on how you can avoid them?
Yeah, great question. So I think developers will hear about ARIA, role states, and properties, and will either misuse them or overuse them. They might say to themselves, "Oh, sweet, I don't have to change any of my tags. I can just slap some attributes on it, and that automatically makes it accessible because the word ARIA is prefixed on a few of my attributes. So looks like my job's done." So I mean, as a lazy or efficient, maybe if you want to sugarcoat it a bit, developer myself, I understand where these developers are coming from, but I think they don't quite realize the implications of not using semantic HTML. And really, if they dug a little deeper, they would realize that they're creating more work for themselves. Not only is the output of what they're creating bad, they're actually when they have to go to fix it, they're creating a lot of extra work. And there's a ton of blogs on this, but I can kind of touch on it really quickly. Where let's take the infamous div class button, and they're like, oh, all I need to do is add role button, but their job won't be done then. They'll still have to add tab index to it, so that's yet another attribute that they wouldn't have to add, and they have to then add an event listener with JavaScript. So they'll select that button, they'll call add event listener, they'll have to pass in key down as the argument, and then handle enter or space presses to trigger their presumably already existing mouse functionality. So a ton of extra stuff you do just to cut a corner and slap an attribute on it. So I think they should really take a step back and understand the implications of taking that shortcut, because it quickly becomes not so much a shortcut. Another mistake I see beginners make, and I definitely made this, is just adding tab index to like everything to make it keyboard accessible. When I was on board at DQ, I got to take some of those awesome DQ University courses. But while I was taking those, they gave me a fun little task of fixing an inaccessible table on one of our fake intentionally broken sites that we use for training. And I went, okay, how does a keyboard user interact with this table? All right, I'll just add tab index equals 0 to every single cell. Hey, look, now you can tab to everything. And I've actually seen people ask similar questions in some of our workshops where it's like, oh, I want my user to interact with this heading, so let me add tab index equals 0 to it. But But you quickly learn with the awesome resources out in the wild that that's not the right thing to do. So I've definitely seen the age-old tab index mistake be made.
Absolutely. So going back to intelligent guided tests, so one of the benefits of it is that you don't have to be an expert in accessibility to use it. And say you're new to the accessibility world, you're still using lots of ARIA tags, and you're still trying to sort your way through accessibility. Tell us more about what intelligent guided tests are in X beta, and how do they really change the game for developers doing accessibility testing?
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. It's awesome to be able to find some of these more complicated accessibility issues without having to be an expert on the subject matter. So turns out, yeah, WCAG and ARIA can be quite complicated in certain ways. So it's nice to have a tool that does some of that heavy lifting. So yeah, the idea is you're answering yes or no or very simple questions, maybe identifying elements that we're asking you about. And then we do the hard work of deriving accessibility issues out of that information. So you don't have to be an expert. So I really like that aspect of it. But one thing I did want to touch on is how amazed I am by some of the newer tools like the keyboard tool and the ARIA modal tool. And what's amazing to me about them is being a front end developer who's focused on accessibility his whole career like me, I was always extremely frustrated with what was even possible in terms of keyboard testing. So before we kind of cracked the code and made these tools, all I knew how to do, and the community would agree too, is like in a unit testing environment, let's say I could simulate a key down. And what that means is I could essentially fire a JavaScript event on a element in like my test environment. And basically all that was possible was that if that element that I fired said key event on had a specific and explicit, I should say, key handler, then that callback, that functionality would actually be invoked. But we could never just fire a real natural tab, like a real tab key press, unless, like I said, that target has something that's done explicitly with JavaScript. So for example, if I just at the beginning of my test said document.fire tab, nothing would happen unless I happened to have an event listener right there on the body where the focus was when I fired that. So the keyboard tool, it fires real tabs, so we can actually replicate almost an identical experience as to what a keyboard only user would be experiencing on that page. So when we figured that out, I was like so excited, not just from a product development standpoint, but like, wow, I want to use this on some of my projects because it was, as far as I knew beforehand, impossible.
Yeah, you can definitely tell that when you've created a great tool when you use it yourself.
Yeah, definitely.
So recently you helped facilitate a workshop that ended up being a big hit, I think, from our perspective, on translating design wireframes into accessible HTML and CSS. Can you talk about how accessibility practice can and really should start in the design phase, and why creating good design wireframes are so important for development later on?
Absolutely. I mean, if you don't start with accessibility in mind, then you are setting yourself up for defeat as far as accessibility is concerned. So it's really important that you're thinking of all these things through all phases of development, whether it starts with the design or sometimes maybe even user research. So like you got to think of what the developer is going to be doing when they're implementing it, and if a ton of information is available to them, it's really easy for them to just address these concerns from the start. So if your wireframes or your Jira ticket, whatever kind of issue tracking you use, whatever the thing that the developer picks up includes information on color contrast, focus order, reading order, accessible names, semantics, like literally use a button here. Don't use that div class button that we talked about a minute ago. You're setting yourself up for success if all that stuff is documented from the start, because it turns out a lot of these things are really easy to do when you're implementing, but become really hard to fix later if you're not thinking of it. So let's take reading order, for example. If I use some weird reverse flex column to display content, and we run some tests with QA or with an accessibility expert when we've already deployed it to maybe staging, or hopefully not, but could be production. Now I have to go and refactor how we've actually set that component up. Whereas it would have been easy if I just knew, oh, reading order is a concern here. Let me make sure it matches what the designer decided, or maybe what the team decided when we're kind of reviewing the designs. So the moral of the story is you're going to save yourself a ton of time if you just think about this stuff from the start, because it becomes exponentially harder the longer that that content is that you're building upon, if it's completely disregarding accessibility. So that kind of touches on not only accessibility from the start, but it actually kind of creates sustainability, because we can take those requirements that these design wireframes have and convert them into like things like unit tests, for example. So we can say, cool, I've implemented this focus order properly. Now let me write a unit test to confirm that that's the case. So if we do build upon this content, like add a new widget or something, we can make sure that that focus order concern has been addressed and it doesn't break. So sustainability is great as well.
Right. So not only are you saving yourself time and energy later down the line, but you're also being more efficient in what you're doing and really setting yourself up for success later on.
Absolutely.
So it's awesome that you fell into the accessibility world and really loved it and dove into it. And that's what's kept propelling you forward to today. What have you found, kind of going back to your early days of accessibility, what have you found to be a good motivator for other developers to get interested in and start baking accessibility into their day-to-day?
Honestly, it's the community. The accessibility community is awesome. I would highly recommend anyone interested as a beginner to find that local accessibility meetup, or the web A11Y Slack channel is awesome, or the accessibility tag on Stack Overflow, anything. These people are extremely passionate and will jump with excitement at an opportunity to answer a newcomer's question about accessibility. But not only like on Slack, but there's like I said, there's meetups, there's blog posts, more and more every day, it seems. There's videos and live streams like that workshop we held. There's tutorials, and there's also accessibility libraries. One that I'll obviously mention is AxeCore, but there's tons of component libraries that are popping up that seem to be striving to be accessible. So no matter what kind of front end framework you might be using, or if it's just plain old CSS and HTML, you can find some great resources on how you can ensure that that stuff you're creating is accessible. I mean, even WCAG and ARIA are publicly available on GitHub. So if you're really interested and you've read through all the resources, you can actually kind of witness these specifications progressing and evolving, which is really cool.
Yeah, it's a really exciting time to be part of the accessibility community. And I think wherever you go, whether it's the accessibility Slack channel or Stack Overflow, you can really feel the fire behind it and the passion that people bring to the table. And I think so much of the time, people are really willing to help too, which is a cool part of it.
Yeah, I mean, it can be kind of frustrating. Like I do hear some frustration from people who are assessing inaccessible content, and it can kind of be discouraging because unfortunately the reality is there's a ton of inaccessible content, and there will continue to be so. So it's awesome to see this community growing. Like it's grown so much that gives me hope that the future of the web might be a little brighter, and hopefully that this trend continues, maybe exponentially, so we can make a better web for everybody.
Well said. So you talked briefly about meetups and other areas where you can kind of find your niche within the accessibility community. So outside of Deque, what other kinds of projects are you involved with, and how would you recommend other people get involved with them?
Sure. I mean, for starters, I should mention I am a member of the ARIA working group. So that's something I do kind of outside of Deque. And it's been awesome to work with some extremely brilliant minds in the accessibility world. I'm learning a ton, and I'm trying to contribute as much as I can to the specification. So it's great to kind of have a on the ground look of that. But I also co-organized the A11Y Alley SD, San Diego Accessibility and Inclusive Design Meetup. We've been around for a little over a year now, and it's been awesome to watch that community grow. I think our first meetup we had a whopping 4 attendees, and that's grown by like a tenfold. And other than that, I mean, when I have free time, I do enjoy contributing to mostly kind of front end accessibility focused open source projects. So you can keep your eye out for that on my GitHub. It's one of my passions. So when I do have time, I like to do that. As far as people who want to get involved in this, I would say reach out. maybe even just on the Slack channel to see if there's anyone in your area who's already doing some kind of inclusive design accessibility meetup. If there's not one, it's not a big deal. You can maybe even start one, but there's definitely going to be some nearby technology specific meetups where you can actually bring your accessibility knowledge and share it with the community. I know that there's a huge JavaScript meetup here in San Diego, and I've seen some awesome talks that are about accessibility, and it's great to kind of share that with the broader community, not just people who are extremely passionate about accessibility.
Fantastic. Well, Harris, thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks so much for your insights into the world of development and accessibility and the accessibility community at large.
Anytime. I love to chat.